11:25 at night, November the 13th, 1985. On a radio frequency out of Tolima, Colombia, the mayor of a small farming town is still talking. He tells a colleague in a neighboring municipality not to worry. The ash has been falling for weeks now. It is settling, he says. The situation is under control. He does not know that a wall of mud is already moving down the Lagunilla River. It is heading straight for his own house. He does not know he has minutes left. Neither does anyone else listening to him. That transmission is the last anyone hears from the town of Armero. 11 minutes later, the mud arrives. By midnight, a town of almost 29,000 people is simply gone. More than 20,000 of its residents die within minutes. They are buried under a moving wall of volcanic mud, 40 meters high, roughly the height of a 12-story building. Across the wider region, the death toll climbs past 23,000.
5,000 homes vanish. 3,000 hectares disappear under mud. Within days, that mud hardens into something close to concrete. The volcano responsible sits 50 kilometers away, 5,000 meters above sea level. It had been silent for 69 years. It had also been giving warnings for the previous 2 months. This is not a story about an unpredictable volcano. It is a story about a warning nobody acted on in time. The volcano is Nevado del Ruiz. The town was called Armero. Locals in the surrounding hills had an older name for the mountain. They called it the Sleeping Lion. In November of 1985, the lion woke up. Armero itself sat in the flat farmland of the Tolima department on the banks of the Lagunilla River. People called it the White City for the cotton and rice fields that once surrounded it. Nobody in 1985 needed to invent a reason to fear that ground.
The town had been rebuilt twice before, directly on top of older volcanic mudflows. One had struck in 1595, another struck in 1845. Both were driven by the same mountain. Both used the same river valley, roughly 2 centuries apart. Armero, in other words, was not built near a hazard. It was built on the hazard's own historical footprint. Everyone had simply forgotten. Geologists did not have to guess at this history. The evidence sat in the ground itself, layered like pages in a book. Deposits from the 17th and 19th century mudflows lay directly beneath the modern streets. They were identifiable by mineral composition and by their exact path down from the crater. Radiocarbon dating of buried organic material later pinned the 2 events precisely.
If you enjoy videos about large-scale cataclysms and the mysteries of the Earth, support the channel by subscribing and liking.
To 1595 and 1845. Both dates matched written Spanish colonial records almost exactly. Every fresh survey confirmed the same conclusion, independently.
This valley floods with mud on a rough, repeating schedule. It does not matter how long the quiet periods last in between. The very first precursors arrived even earlier than most retellings admit. In December of 1984, 3 moderate earthquakes struck within 30 kilometers of the summit. The following month, geologists spotted a brand new crater forming inside the older one. They later named it Arenas. In March, a seismologist working for the United Nations visited the site directly. He watched a vapor column, roughly 150 meters tall, rising steadily from the mountain. His conclusion, filed in an official report, called it a typical precursor of a major eruption. By July, Colombia's Geological Institute had borrowed seismographs from several other countries. The country owned almost no equipment of its own for monitoring an active volcano. The mountain gave its clearest domestic warning in March of 1985. Nevado del Ruiz is only the northernmost peak in a larger volcanic chain, the Ruiz-Tolima Massif. Nearby, Nevado del Tolima and Nevado Santa Isabel share the same glacier-capped structure. Seismographs at the Manizales Volcanological Observatory picked up something specific. A repetitive, rhythmic pattern of small earthquakes concentrated directly beneath the summit. Not one dramatic tremor, a steady rhythm, week after week. That pattern is now textbook evidence of magma forcing its way upward through solid rock. The observatory sent its data to the national government. The government filed it away. By September, the mountain escalated further. On September the 11th, Nevado del Ruiz produced a small phreatic eruption. Superheated groundwater blasted through the surface as steam and ash. No lava was involved at all. Ash drifted onto the roofs of Manizales, Murillo, and Armero itself. Residents swept it off their roofs every morning for weeks. It became routine. Geologist Henry Villegas of Colombia's National Geology and Mining Institute led the mapping team. Their task built the country's first proper hazard map for the volcano. Their task: mark every zone reachable by mudflows, ash, or pyroclastic material in a major eruption. The map was finished on October the 7th, 37 days before the disaster. It named 4 zones of highest risk by name. Armero was one of them. The map went to departmental authorities. Some national newspapers printed versions of it. Fewer than a dozen copies ever reached the towns it was meant to protect. Villegas later gave the plainest explanation on record. The map, he said, ran into serious opposition from economic interests in the region. A volcanic warning threatened property values and agricultural export contracts in one of Colombia's richest farming valleys. Silence protected the economy. It did not protect the people living on top of it. In Colombia's Congress, a representative from the Department of Caldas raised the volcano's threat directly that September. His name was Hernando Arango Monedero. He asked for basic warning sirens, priced at roughly $2,000 apiece. Colombia's Minister of Mines and Energy at the time, Iván Duque Escobar, dismissed the request outright. He told reporters the warnings were full of, in his own words, drama and apocalypse. Arango later gave one more detail from that exchange, almost darkly comic in hindsight. He suggested the ministry simply sell a few of its own government cars to cover the siren costs. The minister apparently took it as a joke rather than a serious proposal. Nothing about the exchange was acted on before the mountains settled the argument itself. Tolima's own governor, Eduardo Alzate Garcia, separately pressed the same minister for money to prepare an evacuation. According to his widow's later account, the minister's reported reply was blunt.
He asked the governor whether he had the funds to evacuate that many people himself. Weeks later, after the disaster, disciplinary proceedings were opened against him. Colombia's Attorney General referred the case to Congress in 1987. Citing possible negligence and omission. He kept his cabinet post for another year regardless. Here is the part most retellings skip entirely. Nevado del Ruiz did not need a massive eruption to kill 23,000 people. Ranked on the standard volcanic explosivity scale, the November eruption barely counts as moderate, a 3 out of 8. Mount St. Helens, in 1980, produced a far larger explosion. It killed 57 people. Washington state authorities had enforced a strict exclusion zone around that mountain for weeks beforehand. Colombia already had far more detailed monitoring data on Ruiz by comparison.
Most of the 57 who died at Mount St. Helens had entered that zone against direct orders or held special passes to retrieve belongings. The comparison seems to suggest Ruiz should have been the smaller tragedy. It was not. The difference was never the size of the blast. It was what sat directly above the crater, waiting to melt. It was whether anyone with power treated the warning as real. Nevado del Ruiz belongs to a specific and especially dangerous category. A stratovolcano, capped year-round by glacial ice, sitting above densely populated valleys. Only a small fraction of the world's roughly 700 stratovolcanoes combine all 3 traits at once. Their mechanism runs on a fixed 4-stage sequence, one geologists can now reproduce in laboratory models. Stage 1. Magma accumulates beneath the summit, deforming the rock above it. This produces exactly the rhythmic small earthquakes recorded that March.
Stage 2. Groundwater meets the rising magma and flashes into steam. It vents through cracks as ash, with no lava at all. That is precisely what happened that September. Stage 3. The magma finally breaches the surface in an explosive burst. It hurls pyroclastic material at temperatures between 500 and 1,000 degrees Celsius. On the night of November the 13th, that column of tephra reached more than 30 kilometers into the sky. The total mass of material ejected came to roughly 35 million metric tons. Alongside it came some 700,000 metric tons of sulfur dioxide gas. Satellite instruments later confirmed the mixture was unusually sulfur-rich. Stage 4 is where geology stops being chemistry. It becomes pure, brutal physics. That superheated material slams straight into the glacier above it. The temperature gap between fresh volcanic rock and glacial ice runs close to 1,000 degrees. At that gap, ice does not melt gradually.
It flashes to liquid almost instantly. On the night of the disaster, this liquefied roughly 10% of the summit ice cap. It happened in a matter of minutes. That 10% released some 200 million cubic meters of water. The meltwater mixed immediately with ash, pulverized rock, and shredded vegetation. The result is called a lahar. A lahar is not a flood, and it is not an avalanche. Its density sits close to that of fresh concrete, dense enough to carry boulders the size of a car, fluid enough to flow like a river. Something that falls into one does not sink. It becomes trapped inside it. To put the volume in perspective, 200 million cubic meters is roughly 80,000 Olympic swimming pools. All of it moved downhill at once, through a handful of narrow river channels. If a story built entirely from verified public records is worth your time, following this channel costs nothing. 4 separate lahars poured down the volcano's flanks that night.
They followed the lowest points in the terrain, the river valleys the mountain had carved over centuries. Speed built quickly on the steep upper slopes. It then held remarkably steady across the flatter plain below, somewhere between 50 and 70 kilometers per hour for tens of kilometers without losing much force. Once a lahar of this scale begins moving, nothing built by 1985 technology could have stopped it. Nothing built today could either. The only real defense is distance, reached early enough to matter. Hours earlier that same afternoon, the pattern had already played out once in miniature. Ash began falling on Armero around 5:30. By 7 that evening, the Red Cross had ordered a first evacuation of the town. Within the hour, the ash fall slowed and briefly stopped. Local officials called the evacuation off. Routine resumed. Nobody yet knew that the larger eruption, the one that would send lahars down the mountain, had not even started. The main eruption began at 9:09 that evening. Word reached the Red Cross office in the city of Ibagué almost immediately. They ordered Armero's evacuation on the spot. But a violent storm had already knocked out electrical power across large parts of the region. Radio communications degraded badly. The evacuation order never reached Armero's officials through any working channel. At 9:45, civil defense staff in Ibagué and nearby Murillo tried repeatedly to reach Armero directly. Nobody answered. What survives instead are scattered fragments caught on amateur radio. Ordinary people talking through the storm, unaware of what was already sliding toward them. Rain and thunder that night were loud enough to mask the deep rumble coming from the crater 50 kilometers away. Armero's own fire brigade broadcast intermittent messages through loudspeakers that evening. They urged residents to remain calm and stay indoors. The official instruction, right up until the final minutes, was simply not to go outside. At 10:20 that night, a cargo plane crossing the region flew directly through the eruption's ash cloud. Pilot Manuel Cervera later reported that smoke and the smell of sulfur filled his cabin. His windows came out etched as if sandblasted. From the ground in Armero, none of this was visible at all. Heavy rain and low cloud hid the mountain completely. There was no glowing summit to point a camera at, no visible plume. Nothing looked like the eruptions people expect from disaster footage. The only sensory clue reaching the town was a low, distant rumble the storm kept covering up. At 11:25, the first pulse of the main lahar reached Armero. Within roughly 10 minutes, it had covered around 70% of the town. 20,000 people died in that first pulse alone. 2 more pulses followed within the hour.
They tore apart whatever structures had somehow survived the first wave. By 11:45, Armero was no longer a town. It was a flat, gray plain of hardened mud. Roof fragments, splintered walls, and uprooted trees broke its surface. The San Lorenzo Hospital sat buried almost to its second floor. The town cemetery disappeared entirely, along with property records and identity documents. In under half an hour, the administrative memory of an entire municipality ceased to exist. In the neighborhood of Santander, a 13-year-old girl named Omaira Sanchez had been awake with her family. They were worrying about the falling ash when the lahar struck her house. It collapsed around her. She ended up trapped from the neck down, pinned by concrete and by the body of her own aunt. The muddy water around her kept rising with the rain. Rescue workers reached her within the first day. They could not free her legs without amputating them, and they had no way to safely do that on site.
For 60 hours, volunteers and journalists stayed beside her, talking, praying, bringing her sweet drinks. French photographer Frank Fournier photographed her in her final hours on November the 16th. The image later carried a title, "The Agony of Omaira Sanchez," and ran in newspapers worldwide. It won World Press Photo of the Year. It became, for much of the world, the single face of the entire disaster. Omaira died before rescuers could free her. Through most of it, she stayed remarkably composed. She sang softly to the volunteers keeping watch over her. She asked repeatedly about a math exam she was afraid of missing at school. Fournier later described the scene in blunt terms. He called it eerily silent, broken only by distant screaming from elsewhere in the wreckage. He said he felt powerless, and that the only thing left to do was document her courage honestly. When the photograph ran worldwide, some accused him of acting like a vulture, profiting from a dying child. Fournier's own answer to that criticism was direct. He said the photograph helped raise international relief funds, and that indifference would have been the worst outcome. Rescue teams could not reach Armero easily by road. Access routes were already cut in several places by mud and flooding. The first helicopters did not arrive until roughly 12 hours later, at dawn on November the 14th. Some were military aircraft. Others were borrowed on short notice from oil companies operating in the region. Colombia's own civilian helicopter fleet was nowhere near large enough for a rescue this size. What they found matched no photograph published in the days that followed. Roughly 3,000 of the municipality's 3,500 hectares now lay buried. A flat gray sheet of hardened mud covered them. A geology student named José Luis Restrepo had been visiting Armero on a field trip that week. He was walking back to his hotel at 10:50 that night when the lahar hit, and survived. Many others never got even that much warning. Colombia's government had another crisis competing for its full attention that same week. On November the 6th, 1 week before the eruption, M19 guerrilla fighters stormed the Palace of Justice in Bogotá. It sat roughly 160 kilometers from Armero. The group took nearly 300 hostages. The military assault to retake the building lasted 28 hours. It left close to 100 people dead, including 11 of the country's Supreme Court justices. The country was still in institutional shock when the volcano's activity intensified again. State attention, in the days that mattered most, sat almost entirely on the capital. 6 days remained before Armero. The mountain kept trembling. The map kept sitting undistributed in a government office. The final irony sits inside a single canceled meeting. 28 hours before the lahar struck, Bogotá had scheduled the official presentation of October's hazard map. Ministry officials, civil defense representatives, and the geologists who built it were all set to attend. The meeting was canceled for administrative reasons. The map stayed in a folder on a desk. Not one street in Armero was ever formally, centrally designated as a mandatory evacuation zone. In the ranking of the 20th century's deadliest volcanic disasters, Armero sits second. Only Martinique's Mount Pelée in 1902 ranks higher. Among the deadliest natural disasters recorded anywhere since the year 1500, Armero ranks fourth. The final tally: more than 23,000 dead, roughly 5,000 injured, over 5,000 homes destroyed. 13 additional municipalities were affected beyond Armero itself. Roughly 7,500 people were left homeless.
The lahars destroyed 50 schools and 2 hospitals outright, along with roads, bridges, and telephone lines across the region. 500,000 bags of coffee, a crop the whole valley depended on, were lost in a single night. Economists later estimated total losses near $1 billion, close to a fifth of Colombia's entire economic output that year. The region lost roughly 60% of its livestock in a single night. Grain and rice harvests fell by 30% as well. Chinchiná, hit by a separate lahar that same night, lost close to 1,000 residents on its own. Anywhere else, that toll alone would dominate headlines for years. It is remembered today mostly as a footnote to Armero. Armero simply lost most of its population in one night. International aid arrived within days, though slowed by another disaster. The 1985 Mexico City earthquake, 2 months earlier, had already stretched global relief resources thin. That earthquake had struck Mexico City on September the 19th, killing thousands and leveling entire city blocks. International search teams, sniffer dogs, and heavy rescue equipment were still committed there when Armero happened. Colombia effectively competed with its own hemisphere for the same limited pool of specialized disaster responders. The United States government sent over $1 million in emergency aid. The serving U.S. ambassador personally donated $25,000 of his own money. Washington's Disaster Relief Agency dispatched a scientist from the U.S. Geological Survey. A dozen additional relief specialists joined to assist Colombian teams directly. Rescue coordination split across several cities at once. Ibagué and Bogotá organized relief for Armero itself, while Cali gathered medical teams bound for Chinchiná. Makeshift triage stations went up in Lerida, Guayabal, and Mariquita. They were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer number of casualties arriving. Surviving patients were eventually redirected to hospitals in Ibagué. Local medical facilities near the volcano were already destroyed or at risk themselves. Henry Villegas, the geologist who led the mapping effort, spoke to journalists afterward. His account is now part of the Institute's own archive. The map, he said, had been technically sound and clearly labeled. Its failure to reach the people who needed it came from resistance that was never technical. It came from people protecting economic interests. Colombia's Congress opened a formal investigation. It produced no criminal convictions against any official involved. President Belisario Betancourt publicly acknowledged that the warning system had failed. Minister Duque Escobar kept his cabinet position for roughly another year. 8 months after the disaster, on July 1, 1986, the Pope visited.
John Paul II came to the site in person. He declared the ground where Armero once stood to be holy ground. The town itself was never rebuilt on the same spot. Geologists ruled the site permanently unsafe for new construction. 12 kilometers to the south, survivors founded a new town, Armero Guayabal. The original site became something closer to an open-air cemetery. Hand-painted family names still mark simple concrete markers there, weathered now by 40 years of tropical sun over hardened mud. In November of 2025, on the disaster's 40th anniversary, local authorities opened a new memorial garden there. They named it the Garden of Life, built directly over the buried ground of the original town. Family associations from Armero attended the opening. Many placed flowers on the same ground where their own relatives' homes once stood. Local officials described the garden as an attempt to hold both truths at once. A place to grieve, and a place that still keeps growing, 40 years after the mud finally stopped moving. Two brothers, Jose and Hernan Dario Nova, later opened a small visitor center at the original site. Their stated goal was straightforward: tell the complete story, not the sanitized official version. Their own description of the place, recorded in interviews, does not soften anything. A valley of lost lives, wrecked homes, and overturned cars. Uprooted trees and boulders carried far from where they belonged, all sealed beneath mud baked hard by decades of sun. Colombian filmmakers have since returned to the story more than once, including a feature film named simply Armero. The tragedy stays in national memory well beyond the generation that lived through it. The uncomfortable question at the center of Armero's official record is not geological, it is administrative. Why did a completed hazard map fail to produce a single centralized evacuation order? It had been distributed to departmental authorities and printed in national newspapers. 4 zones were named directly, Armero among them. Villegas offered the most honest answer on record. The short window between finishing the map and the eruption made fast distribution genuinely difficult, he said. But the deeper obstacle, in his own account, was never about time. It was about interests. The danger never fully receded, even in smaller form. In 2006, heavy rain on the volcano's flanks triggered a mudslide down the Chinchiná River. It was the same river that carried a lahar into the town in 1985. 9 children, aged between 12 and 19, died on a scouting expedition near the volcano that day. No eruption was involved at all, only rain and unstable slopes. The mountain does not need to erupt to prove its valleys are still dangerous. Nevado del Ruiz did not go back to sleep after 1985.
Between 1987 and 1991, it stayed persistently active. In 1989, authorities evacuated roughly 2,300 people along 5 nearby river valleys as a precaution. A further eruption is considered likely to have occurred in April of 1994. Current monitoring places the volcano at yellow alert, the second level on Colombia's 4-tier scale. Low-level ash emissions and minor seismic activity continue through this year. It has technically been in some form of eruptive activity since around 2012. The disaster also pushed the United Nations to act on a global scale. It named the 1990s the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction, funding a coordinated research program. 16 of the world's most hazardous volcanoes came under intensive, permanent study as a result. What changed permanently was not the mountain, it was the country's relationship with monitoring it. Colombia's national disaster management system was entirely rebuilt after Armero. Today, it operates as the National Unit for Disaster Risk Management, running formal, regularly tested evacuation protocols. Colombia's Geological Survey now operates one of the most advanced lahar early warning networks anywhere in Latin America. The institute that failed to distribute its own map in 1985 still exists today, renamed the Servicio Geológico Colombiano. It carries the lesson forward under a different name. Acoustic flow monitors, small sensors buried directly in riverbeds below the summit, detect a passing lahar's specific ground vibration. Alongside them sits a network of trained volunteer river observers, stationed along the same channels, watching and reporting by radio. Each acoustic sensor listens for a specific low-frequency vibration, distinct from an ordinary river current or a passing truck on a nearby bridge.
Once a lahar trips 2 or more sensors along the same channel, an automatic alert reaches regional emergency offices within seconds. Volunteer river observers exist specifically because instruments alone cannot see everything a moving valley might do. A person standing on a bridge at dusk still catches details no sensor buried in a riverbed ever will. Sirens now stand in the towns most exposed, tied to both systems at once. Schools across the Tolima region teach volcanic hazard response as part of routine coursework, not as an occasional drill. In the United States, the tragedy directly shaped a new institution. A joint effort between the U.S. Geological Survey and USAID took shape from that lesson. It became the Volcano Disaster Assistance Program. It now tracks roughly 1,550 potentially active volcanoes worldwide. It has assisted in more than 30 international volcanic crises since it was founded.
That program's clearest success story arrived barely 6 years later on the other side of the Pacific. Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines began showing warning signs in 1991. The newly formed program deployed scientists and equipment immediately. Roughly 75,000 people were evacuated in time. The eruption that followed was far larger than Ruiz's had ever been. The death toll stayed in the hundreds, not the tens of thousands. A lesson learned in a Colombian valley at devastating cost saved lives on another continent. The scale of that success is worth sitting with directly. Philippine and American authorities evacuated well over 200,000 people from the wider danger zone before Pinatubo's climactic blast. That included more than 15,000 American military personnel and their families, cleared out of Clark Air Base days ahead of the eruption. Pinatubo's final death toll came in under 1,000 people against an eruption several times larger than the one that erased Armero. It happened within a single decade. Colombia itself later proved it had absorbed its own lesson too. In 2007, a neighboring volcano, Nevado del Huila, began reactivating. The rebuilt Geological Survey alerted authorities immediately. Huila erupted in 2008. More than 4,000 residents of the nearby town of Belalcázar had already been evacuated. A lahar swept through less than an hour later. Nobody died. It stands today as close to a mirror image of Armero, using the identical geological mechanism 23 years apart. Here is the strangest fact buried in the official record, one that surfaced only in later analysis. Scientists studying the seismic data from the final hours before the main eruption found something specific. Long-period earthquakes, a signal that builds strongly and then fades slowly.
Volcanologist Bernard Chouette later put it in blunt, human terms. The volcano, in his words, was effectively screaming that it was about to explode. Nobody monitoring the data in real time that November recognized the signal for what it was. The information existed. The instruments were not broken. Nobody yet knew how to correctly read what they were looking at. That specific signal is now a standard part of volcano monitoring worldwide. It is taught directly from the Ruiz case, precisely because nobody caught it the first time. Zoom out from Armero, and the numbers only grow more uncomfortable. Today, roughly 500,000 people live in the river valleys directly threatened by future lahars from this same volcano. They are spread across the Combeima, Chinchiná, Cuello Toche, and Gualí drainages. Of those, around 100,000 are officially classified as being at high risk. Named towns still sitting inside the hazard zone today include Honda, Mariquita, and Ambalema. Herveo, Villahermosa, Puerto Salgar, La Dorada, and Chinchiná itself round out the list. Manizales, the regional capital, is home to several 100,000 people. It sits closer to the crater than Armero ever did, on the volcano's opposite flank. Melting just 10% of the volcano's remaining ice cap would generate a comparable lahar today. That is the same fraction that melted in 1985. Since 1570 alone, records document 13 separate eruptions at the volcano. That works out to roughly 1 every 35 years. Since 1900 alone, the volcano has stayed active roughly 1 year out of every 5 on average. That is not a distant, abstract statistic. For a child born in one of these valleys this year, the volcano's next active phase likely arrives before adulthood. One factor makes today's danger measurably different than in 1985, and not in a reassuring direction. The volcano's glacial ice cap has shrunk by roughly 60% since the disaster. It has gone from about 25 square kilometers of ice down to something closer to 10. Less ice sounds intuitively like less water available to fuel a future lahar. Climate scientists studying the mountain describe the opposite risk. A thinner, more fractured ice cap can destabilize and collapse more easily during even a modest eruption. It can release its meltwater in a faster, more concentrated pulse than a thick, stable cap ever would. The fuel supply is shrinking. The trigger required to unleash it may be getting smaller too. Armero also became a case study far outside volcanology itself. Researchers studying disaster psychology in low-income countries later used the tragedy as a benchmark case. It documented how entire communities absorb loss on this scale. Decades on, mental health researchers still cite Armero directly. They use it to study how entire towns process collective trauma, not only how individuals do. Every generation that has lived in this stretch of the Tolima Valley made an assumption. They assumed the flat, fertile land they were born onto had simply always been there. It had not. It was built from mud, laid down twice before by the exact same mountain. Once in 1595, again in 1845, following the exact same river channels. Armero sat, unknowingly, on top of its own future. The White City's cotton fields grew in soil created by the very disaster that would eventually erase them. Chinchina sat on the same kind of borrowed ground. It paid nearly the same price on the very same night. Neither town chose recklessness. Both simply inherited a landscape whose real history nobody had thought to pass down to them. If stories built entirely from verified public records matter to you, following this channel helps it keep finding them. Nevado del Ruiz produced by volcanic standards a modest eruption on the night of November 13, 1985. 23,000 people did not die because the mountain was unusually powerful. They died because a map that had already answered the only question that mattered sat unopened. It sat in a folder on a desk in Bogotá, 28 hours before it was too late. The volcano is still there today. So are the valleys, and the roughly 500,000 people living inside them. The map exists again, in far more detail than in 1985. The instruments are better. The protocols are written down and tested. What has never been fully answered is the only question that truly mattered that night. If every piece of information needed is already sitting on the table again, what would it take? What would it actually take, this time, for the warning to arrive?